Our mission: Helping Parents Heal is a nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting bereaved parents to become shining light parents by providing support and resources to aid in the healing process. We go a step beyond other groups by allowing the open discussion of spiritual experiences and evidence for the afterlife in a non-dogmatic way. Affiliate groups welcome everyone, regardless of religious or non-religious background. Attendance today at this meeting is voluntary, and we are here for the benefit of learning from and sharing with other parents whose child has passed away. It is understood that our discussions are intended to be confidential and not designed to replace traditional therapy or spiritual counseling. However, these Zoom meetings are helpful to parents all around the world, and they are posted on YouTube so that affiliate members who are not able to attend this meeting live can also watch. Helping Parents Heal offers a wide variety of speakers to allow parents to be informed about many possible ways to heal, to connect with their children, and to learn about the afterlife. The views expressed by our guests do not necessarily reflect those of Helping Parents Heal, and we ask that you take from their presentations whatever may benefit you personally. Welcome, everyone.
Well, thank you, Irene. I guess I'll go ahead and get started here. I thought, first off, I'd let everybody know how I met Richard. And it goes back to the year 2007. At that point, I had written my first book, which would eventually become Soul Shift. I didn't have a full title at the time, but I didn't have a literary agent, and I was trying to get a publisher, and I put together a query package that included some sample chapters and an overview synopsis, and sent it out to, I think I was on number 30. And I had a couple that showed some interest, but were kind of stringing me along, but a lot of Dear John letters along the way. And I was actually driving from Phoenix to LA, and I was around maybe San Bernardino or Riverside, and my phone rang, and Richard was on the other end of the line, and he started talking to me about the book and how quickly he could get it published and everything. So I got really excited. And in 2008, in July of 2008, Soul Shift was released, and he was the publisher, and that's how we got to know each other. Richard has a very diverse background. He's been a publisher for many, many years. Right now he's with Inner Traditions, which is a great publishing house that does the kind of work that most of us are interested in. He's one of the most open and honest people I've ever known. Even within his background, he doesn't, there's a lot of things that, he just openly shares that some people wouldn't, and I give him a lot of credit for that. He's got nothing to hide. I think it's great. So I thought, instead of me reading his bio, I'll just turn it over to him to tell you all a little bit about his background and how he got started and developed along the path that he's on. And in addition to being a publisher, he's written countless books. I mean, he's a prolific author. So Richard, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then we'll get into the subject matter.
Right. Yeah, we were talking about what we were going to do as a bio and realized we didn't actually have a formal one together. So I'll do one like on the spot. That gives some context. I grew up in New York City. I went to Amherst College, majored in English, then went to the University of Michigan and got a Ph.D. in anthropology. I had thought I was going to study myth, religion, and shamanism, but it didn't work out that way. Complicated department politics. This was the 60s. And I ended up actually, to get the degree, doing a study of fishermen in Maine, which is where I'm living now in Maine. But I taught college for 7 years in Maine and Vermont. And then my wife and I, with 2 little kids, moved to California in 1977 with no job or any idea what to do. I did have an advance from a publisher to write a history of alternative medicine, which became the start. At that point, I was a literary writer doing experimental prose books. And then I switched to doing books on subject matter. And I did books on non-Western medicine and healing, then on cosmology and astronomy, then on embryology, and then on consciousness. And that marked the sort of general range of what I wrote on. And at the same time, the publishing company took off and became a source of income. So I stopped looking for another college teaching job, and I ran the publishing for 40 years or so, some of them with my wife. And we built it into a fairly significant publishing company in Berkeley, doing topics like this, one of which was Mark's book. It's hard for me to remember exactly what all we did, but I think John Klimo was the person writing on this topic that we had done most substantially before. And I'm sure we did other things that touched on the topic because there are different avenues to it. For instance, writing about past lives is not the same as the afterlife, communicating with people in the afterlife, but it's part of the same kind of set, and it relies on the same, soul shift or paradigm shift to kind of encompass it within a worldview. In any case, I don't know any way to, without getting into it, and I don't want to get into it, any other way to say what happened at the press, but I was cancel cultured out of the press by a revolt. It was a nonprofit, so we never owned it. And then Inner Traditions, who had been our main rival, immediately hired me to bring my authors there, which will mean ultimately bringing Mark there too. And we're already bringing his second book there, which was put out of print by them. And so I've been developing a list at Inner Traditions, about 80 books in a year and a half. And a few of them have been on this topic, most notably Matt McKay's second book, after Seeking Jordan, his book, The Luminous Landscape of the Afterlife. And then he also did another book, partially channeled from Jordan, called Love in a Time of Impermanence. And did I want to, oh yeah, I know, I did want to say one other thing. This is outside the ordinary biography, but in the context of this, it makes sense to say, I don't have the experience of the people here. The experience I have is that my mother, brother, and sister all committed suicide. And that, that energy lies at the core of my identity, not even the suicides per se, but growing up in a family where that was en route to happening, growing up in the sort of vortex of that situation. And I've had to process all of that. And a lot of my seeking has been sort of what this group is doing, which is heal in the process of healing. And Mark certainly speaks to that, as does Matt McKay. You do more than like make peace with the loss. You actually heal through it, and it becomes an opportunity rather than just a deficit. It's an opportunity to heal and to grow. I was noticing in the very popular, if anybody's seen it, the popular serial Crash Landing on You about North and South Korea, that where the woman paraglides into North Korea by mistake and has to hide out there. But in a dialogue with the North Korean soldier, he talks about, they both talk about getting on the wrong train, headed to, and only once they get on the wrong train do they realize it's the only train that's taking them to the place they need to be. And I think that's certainly the parable that fits for this situation. Nobody wanted to get on that train, but if it leads to a deeper understanding and to healing, then it ultimately leads to a place that's, in a way, in the total scope of lifetimes and worlds, transcends the kind of horrificness of the original situation. So on that, let me pass it back to Mark to
Yeah, and I want to let everyone know, we want to do this kind of as an open dialogue, so we'll be monitoring the chat and maybe asking questions along the way. So it's a two-way dialogue. But I thought I'd start off by just going back in Richard's history a little bit. I noted that you took a creative writing class as a youngster in 1960 and then followed up as a journalist and then as a reporter for some, I'm assuming, smaller newspapers. I just wondered, was that
summer camp newspaper? Oh yeah, I did work one summer in college for the Sullivan County Democrat in
were
New York
those
State.
were those early experiences kind of your launching into your love of writing as a vehicle for expressing your inquisitive mind, or not?
Well, maybe a little bit, but I don't think so. I think that the real source of it was being thrown into psychoanalysis at age 8
Okay.
in New York City with a psychiatrist from Vienna who had studied with Freud. And then he died when I was 13, and then I had another one. And the dialogue with these two mentors, I don't think of them as healers as much as mentors, just created in me a sense of telling of, you talked about honesty. It created a sense of candor and honesty. And when I was invited into this creative writing class in high school, I didn't really know what to write. So I just wrote my own stories, and I realized I didn't have to be telling them to this therapist, that I could just tell them to the universe. And that began a process. By the time I got to college, that's what I was doing. And then I met more avant-garde writers and got interested in kind of getting more deeply into the visionary aspect of writing. And once I did, I stayed on that path, but still write narratives, still write my own, write stories, but not fiction, true stories.
Right. So you're interested in topics like around the area of spirituality and consciousness. Did that kind of evolve over time, or was that from the time that some of your family members decided to leave the planet?
Well, that wasn't until well along. I mean, the first one that decided that, I was already 30 when my mother committed suicide. I I think that, I don't know, I think that for many people that it's just implicit for one reason or another that you have that orientation. I have found that it just grows year by year. Um, I've come to feel that you don't even necessarily have to read books. You don't have to do spiritual practices, although it helps. I think that the more that you do that fills in and gives you gives you the confidence and the experience of this thing, the more you begin to fill it in yourself. And I think it's really important for this kind of context. Nobody is actually going to give you the thing that makes the difference. The thing that makes the difference is already inside you, and it's going to come out. And just, listening to the very few people who've commented so far, I see that that they're not struggling to overcome the loss. They are participating in a kind of inner knowing and sense of vastness that you can only cultivate from within.
Yeah, and before we booked this, you and I had talked a little bit about the topics we cover, and kind of in a broad general sense, what we came up with was, how can the folks on this meeting trust the reality of their spiritual experiences, not doubt them, not question them, and along those lines. Do you have any thoughts pertaining to that?
Well, I mean, anything one says is like an oversimplification and a model. But I feel as though this reality that we're in is not, I mean, obviously, this belief is shared by others here, but it's not the only reality. But in order for us to participate in it, those other realities have to be encrypted in some way, separated from us. And we can't actually get at them in an ordinary sense. And if we could, and maybe collectively we will at some future time, but if we could, then the tightness and the teaching of this reality would evaporate in a way. You would lose like John Friedlander, who's a psychic I've studied with for many years, says people choose to come to this reality because it is such a tough reality. He calls it a mud run for the soul. That you can't alter things. You have to accept them as they are, and kind of find your faith and your truth within that. And that's what this reality is about. It's not it's not a malleable reality. So you can't expect to suddenly shift, to use your word in your title, to shift to a different belief system. I think it's that you recognize, in this case, locating souls in the afterlife, you recognize that you're not going to locate them in the same way they existed in this world, because they exist as souls, and the soul is bigger than the person. A soul, I think a soul emanates through many people, maybe many at the same time on many worlds. And that when you you go to a person who has passed back to the soul, that who you find is the soul. You don't find the individual person. Now, other people may have a very different experience, and each case is also different. And in some cases, the soul the soul and the person may overlap to a greater degree. I think of the wonderful line in Whitley Strieber's book about the afterlife. I forget what that's titled right now, but his wife, Anne, says to him, "I'm not Anne anymore, but I'll always be Anne to you." And I think that that's a pretty profound statement. That because I think it's true in this world also. I think that each of us, and for that matter, each of our children, is not who they seem to be, and who you lose is not who you seem to lose. That's a particular form that's there for a time. And the larger picture, I was thinking when at one point when Mark and I, maybe a number of years ago, were talking about this, and I was thinking about issues I had with our adult kids, and I realized that in some ways you always lose the child that grew up. They turn into something else, and if they turn into something else by crossing into another form, or they cross into a somewhat different form in a more trackable way within this reality, it's still change. And I don't I have this argument with my wife all the time. I'm not I'm not as involved in our children anymore, because they become people like the other people in the world, and the part of them that made them our children is not as evident. They've come into very different forms and been shaped by other forces, and um, that's going to happen regardless. And of course, everything will pass. Each one of us will pass, and so I don't know.
A lot of the folks on this meeting have probably read the Robert Schwartz books, and his conclusion isn't exactly the same, but it's the idea of soul groups, so each of us is part of something larger, which it's similar, maybe not exactly the same concept.
Well, it is. I mean, because what we have are approximations of a concept that's so vast that we can't put it into any one model.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of folks, even I think that in some way there is one consciousness, and we're like subsets of that almost. I envision, like, if you looked at a tree and a leaf, we're like a cell on a leaf of a tree, and we're part of the leaf. The leaf is part of the tree is part of the earth is part of the solar system, which is part of our galaxy, which is part of the universe, and on and on. But like an agent of consciousness, an individualized aspect per se, I don't know. That's just kind of how I visualize it.
It doesn't change the fact that the loss is excruciating and searing, and that there isn't any ordinary way to cross the bridge at that point. I imagine for each of the people in this group, that they come to that moment when it looks as though the bridge is uncrossable. And then it's the case of what do you do when you're at that point? And you make a change, and that change, whatever change you make, will be with you forever, from your own lifetime to lifetime. And that change, in a sense, is the reconnection with the lost child. I mean, don't you think? I mean, it's certainly true for you. It's
Oh, yeah. I mean, you have to accept that the life going forward isn't going to be the same as what it was. And that you know, the child that you had is now in a different form, you know, than before, or maybe it's a broader form that always existed, but you just knew one aspect of that
Right.
soul.
Well, I think it is a broader form that always existed, and that part of the, I mean, sometimes I think that what a life is the form evolves, but then when it has to go through the birth process again, it sort of loses the memory, goes back to zero, but it doesn't lose the karma or the aura or the soul that goes with it, but it grows into that through a different being. And gradually reclaims its larger identity.
So one thing you touched on earlier was the way that this world is kind of sealed off from the greater reality for the purpose, I guess, of soul evolution, right? And if that's, and we're speculating here, obviously, but if that's the case,
Well,
do you
probably
envision?
set up by us. You know, it's not, I don't think of it as a reality that somebody set up and put us in, like, you know, a computer game. I think that the deepest and most intelligent part of ourselves created this reality because it was exactly what we needed at this point.
Do you, this is some more of a technical explanation, but there's a theory that the brain is kind of the limiter, that it actually, rather than produces consciousness, it's the sifter that filters it down to where we function in this world and kind of don't typically, but occasionally perceive those expanded or extended realities. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I wrote it. Actually, this is the most recent book of mine. It's called Bottoming Out the Universe, Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing. And that's one of the topics I talk about in there. I have lots of other books, as Mark said, but most of them, all of them that went out of print with other publishers, I republished with my own press, but then in their hostile takeover, they put all of those out of print. So this is actually, the other books are kind of on Amazon, but this is the only one in print. And it's probably the only one in which I deal really directly with this topic. And I have a chapter on the brain and trying to think of it in terms of, I mean, I guess you have to take a step back and say, and I think it's obvious, but there are two totally different views of reality that exist in the modern world. There are nuances within them, but the two are the belief that all of this happened by accident. The Big Bang occurred. It was like this explosion in the middle of nowhere for no reason, 13.8 billion Earth years ago. And everything that's happened has just come about by molecules interacting. And nobody is actually really alive in any substantial sense. We're just, we're kind of like algorithms experiencing hallucinations, and the world itself is a mirage created by the same molecules. And thus there isn't any, in that view, there isn't any afterlife. How could there be? Because there isn't even really a life here to begin with. We're not alive in the sense that we have an independent personal existence. We have the illusion of that because the molecules inside us create synapses that that go together and flow into the brain and create the thoughts and ideas and actions that make us feel we're alive. In the other worldview, and this is the worldview in a sense you're talking about when you say the brain is just a filter. In that worldview, we are exist already, and matter, the matter we're in, is in some sense a thought form created by our collective participation in an energy field. This falls into the old Hindu and then theosophical seven planes of consciousness, whereby the energy to create this reality starts up on the monadic plane and comes down through the atmic plane. They have many names too, but ultimately passes through into the causal plane, the astral plane, the etheric subplane, and then manifests as this reality. Well, these are just words, and unless you actually study and participate in the system, that they don't amount to more than words. But the idea that there are totally other realities through which the energy field that's here had to pass before it became dense enough to form this world is itself a notion that is obviously very different than the idea of a big bang followed by algorithms. So in the brain then, which evolved through matter within the scientific model, it is like the source of consciousness. But in the model of energy fields, the brain simply evolved to attune a much larger consciousness to this dense field. And it's not a creator of consciousness, but a limiter of consciousness, because it focuses and attunes it to just this one field.
Would that be described as idealism, maybe, or panpsychism, or maybe there's no exact definition, I guess.
Yeah, I think that we, especially because of the audience in which we're talking, I think it's better to move towards reality, see what people bring up, and we don't have to name it. We're just trying to get a feel for what it is that people experience. Like if we had endless time, what I'd be most interested in is how each person in this group, like in this podcast, came, like, crossed that bridge, was able to find their own faith and find in their heart and soul the strength to make the conversion, so that it wasn't just trying to make themselves feel better, that it or kind of just convincing themselves of something to ease the pain, but it was actually a revelation. I imagine maybe not everyone, but I imagine most people in this group experienced it ultimately as a revelation when everything changed. And I
So
think
if anyone wants to share that, their personal story briefly, we can bring that up. I see Gianna said, what changed for me is that he doesn't need me anymore. And being needed has been a huge part of my identity as a mom. So that's, I guess, a hole left in her heart, in terms of how that makes her feel. Teresa said, I joined a couple of reincarnation sites, and one of them says that they feel we come back very soon and we aren't part of soul groups. How do we know there are soul groups? That's a question.
How do we know anything, in a way? I think that people arrive, boy, that's, in a way, that's a tough one to really address. I did work with that in Bottoming Out the Universe, trying to make a distinction between soul groups and other ways of looking at it. I think that I don't think it matters whether you call them soul groups or not. It's just a way of looking at it. In the theory I'm talking about, in the plane above the causal plane, our souls exist in groups. I mean, great, people who meditated on this in ancient times came up with this discovery or realization that when they meditated at a higher level, their soul was interfaced with other souls, and that they recognize they have particular affinity with other souls and that they belong to soul groups. And this is something a lot in John Friedlander's writing. He studied at Berkeley Psychic Institute, but then he also sat with Jane Roberts when she channeled Seth. And I just put together a new book of his that I drew from like 15 years of teaching. So it won't be out till next year, called Recentering Seth. And I just transcribed sections from his classes. And in that book, he talks a lot about how we come to recognize and understand soul groups. I see it as that certain people seem connected to us in some way in this world.
I agree. I think there's kind of a soul recognition that you feel like when you meet somebody. Maybe you meet them for the first time, or maybe it's a family member that you just feel an affinity toward. To me, that's kind of the clue.
So you can call it a soul group, but we don't know in other planes of reality whether what goes over, whether even the word group would go over, whether you'd call it that.
So Irene said, for many of us, the shift occurred when we connected with our children through a medium. Many of us received proof when a message came through that was personal to us that no one else would know. So certainly I touched on that a lot in Soul Shift in my second book. And I'm sure, I don't know if you had any commentary about that whole idea of mediums.
I was working on that today. I just finished working on a kind of insane political book and went back to my memoir writing yesterday. And I was writing about, right before my sister's suicide, which was the last one, I met a medium in Vermont who I ended up doing the autobiography of under the title Jump Girl. And she's very amazing at connecting people to souls. Her name is Sally Crow. She spells it as one word, Salicrow. And she's half Blackfoot, half native Blackfoot and half Irish. So she has Native American training from her Blackfoot great-grandmother and Druid and Irish training. And she just has always seen souls. She says she can't go into an airport without seeing souls, spirits following the people around. And when I did the book with her, I asked her could she just show me what she did? And I couldn't see. She basically called up the spirit of my mother, who had been dead 42 years, and had a dialogue with her in which she told me intimate details of my mother's life that I knew and others that I didn't know, but which filled holes in the situation. But I never felt as though she was speaking to my mother. I felt as though she was speaking to a spirit, and that the spirit, and I've discussed this endlessly with John Friedlander and other psychics, and I think the reality is more complicated because I think our aura and our children's auras are interconnected across lifetimes. Now I'm sort of freelancing out here. So from lifetime to lifetime, our auras are depositing information in each other that are much vaster than what we ever know personally. So if a person dies, whether it's a child or a parent or someone else, and a medium is reading, I think they're not only reading the spirit, they're reading your own aura where the spirit has deposited a record that you couldn't even read at the time it was being deposited. And at the same time, the person who you're trying to speak to is also informing the spirit, but I don't think that they are the spirit. Now, I don't want to, I don't mean to refute anybody's experience of that. I think if you speak to a medium and the medium reports from the afterlife, that's real, and that's an indication of the it's an indication that the soul has gone on and is elsewhere. But I'm just making the case, or at least throwing out the idea, that you're not actually talking to the person. You're talking to a spirit intermediary, which is a form of the person, but it doesn't exist in present time. You can't get to the present time where the person is, because time doesn't exist there in the same way. So you engage with this intermediary spirit, and that's actually meant to be a bit helpful, because if the person you're trying to talk to doesn't exactly answer the way they would if you were talking in a room, there's a reason for that.
So a lot of mediums say they have spirit guides, and a lot of the communication comes through the spirit guide. So that might be kind of the same thing
Another
you're
way of
talking about.
saying it, yeah, that it's almost like instead of talking to the person, the spirit guide goes and checks it out and then comes back and tells you.
And I just actually checked out a new medium about a week ago that did one of the best readings I've ever had.
Mhm.
And this is something that's happened to me a lot, where I think that some people who have passed know how to communicate better. And it was my dad. My dad pops in like he's the guide, and he's actually becoming that intermediary. And my guess is that he knew how to do that on Earth as a medium. And now he's able to facilitate that more effectively on the other side. And they noted a number of these, including this one, and talked about how strong he was, how well the communication was, and the personality really came through and all that, but seemed to have a hand in a lot of the communications. And then she'd say things like, well, when she brought to my son, things about him, that he was there, that he communicated, but also there were others there, like my mother, who's just kind of making their presence known, but not necessarily directly communicating. So, yeah.
And I would think that it's not that they're moribund, it's just that there are whole other ways of dealing with existing than the way we deal with it. We're in a very busy reality. But I think that, and we're also inside of time. But if you get outside of time and into another reality, you're not necessarily, even if they're people you really care about, you're not necessarily interested in engaging with them socially or personally, because you've changed the nature of your relationship to existence itself.
Stephanie had a comment here, which is kind of half question, half comment. She said, for me to think my child has to choose one soul group or another is quite limiting. If spirit is vast, we can be in many soul groups at once, which is what has been shown to me. I can't put limits on spirit.
Yeah, I think in that system, in that particular system, it's only at the level in the fourth plane, the Buddhic plane, as it's called in that system, that you're a soul group, that you're in a single soul group. If you go up one more plane to the Atmic plane and then another to the monadic plane, in the Atmic plane, you're in multiple soul groups on multiple worlds. And then I think it's in the monadic plane that you're in that your soul groups themselves are in multiple soul groups in other dimensions. And then that scale only goes as far as the human operating system, or human this particular realm of existence. And apparently there are other planes and planes beyond that. So it's not meant to be limiting. It's just meant to say that the next stage above a personal soul is a group soul.
It's interesting too, when you think about how we think of everything within the framework of this world. We can't help ourselves, I guess, but it's with a lot of the near-death experience accounts, you hear these descriptions that they can't really completely describe. Whether it's a range of colors they've never seen before, a feeling of deep love that they've never sensed before, and other things that are beyond explanation. They come back and say, I knew everything was connected, but I can't really explain that to you in words.
What I feel, and I don't have an exact experience that corresponds to people here, but what I feel is that there are two parts of me. and one part drags along and can pretty much get discouraged by anything and everything. And the world provides plenty of occasions for that. And then when the other part comes in, it's like amazingly light. And suddenly everything is visionary and it lights up. Like I had this a couple of weeks ago. I went to the farmers market in Bar Harbor, and I just was looking for pumpkins so we could do Halloween this year. And I was going to give away books instead of candy. With children. But I didn't see a lot of pumpkins at the farmer's market, and I didn't want to buy a crappy one at Walmart or something. But then there was 3 at this one stand, and I just picked out the biggest one. It said $15 on it, and I bought it and paid. And then this kid, who turned out to be 8 years old, was so excited. He had waited for 2 hours at the market for somebody to buy one of the 3 pumpkins he had raised, and he got the money. And it was too big for me to carry home, so I had to go get it. It was only a few blocks away. I got the car and drove back and gave him a children's book. And he was so excited that not only had he sold the pumpkin and gotten the money, but gotten the children's book. And as I was leaving the market, the world just seemed vast from this little incident. And I shifted, and it had nothing to do with that exchange. I mean, that was this very small exchange. And yet I saw the scope of everything and the interconnection of everything, because that gesture, the back and forth and the interaction had just opened that up inside of me. And that was the tiniest of things. And with people here, we're dealing with a huge rupture and lesion. And so if they get opened up, if people get opened up by that, and find like heart and spirit in it, that's just so enlarging. It doesn't mean you get to stay there. I'm sure there are really discouraging moments, but you won't ever lose that. And then there'll be moments like with the pumpkin at the farmer's market where it'll be awakened and you realize I still have it, that's mine, that can't be taken away.
Teresa brought up something else. This kind of goes back to the refinement of the soul as part of living in this challenging world. She says, I think after every tragedy, we awaken more, and there is a knowing that we've had all along, or that we have all along. Let's see if we have others here.
Yeah, it's like, it reminds me of the line with which Thornton Wilder closed The Bridge of San Luis Rey, that a book about, like, I don't remember it well, but about a lot of people dying, and the last phrase of the book is love, the only bridge, the only survival, and love in the biggest sense, it is like a bridge and is a survival.
Stephanie says, I love that pumpkin story.
I know, it's these little tiny things that remind you don't need big things to suddenly convert the energy. And go ahead.
I was just going to say, I saw a video. I haven't seen the whole thing, but it was from IANS. That's the International Association of Near-Death Studies. They'll periodically send out clips, but it was a woman who had a near-death experience, and during hers, she had a being of light or God or whatever, convey to her this one moment in her life. It's like a flashback, the life review thing. But it was where she was standing in line in a grocery store behind a woman who didn't have quite enough money to pay for the groceries on the belt, and she was going to have to pull some off. And she says, "Don't worry about that." And she paid the difference, and she thanked her, and it was like this little thing to her. She's like, "Well, that was just one little thing." And he goes, and what was told to her in this experience was that had such a domino effect down the line, and it showed the other woman how she was then serving at a homeless shelter later, serving food and doing all these other things, and then it had an exponential effect.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
It's interesting to see how these little things really may be the most important things in some cases.
Yeah.
So along the lines of our discussion, was there anything else you'd like to dive into that you think would be relevant to the group? Recognizing these are folks who have had a child pass. Some have had experiences with mediums or maybe direct connection experiences or deep meditation, and others may not be as far along.
Yeah, I approached it from the standpoint of not wanting to impose a lot of stuff, but engage in an exchange. I guess what occurs to me is Matt's story. I knew Matt very early when we lived in California because both of us did publishing companies, and he was a psychotherapist, and he wasn't particularly, I won't say he wasn't open to spiritual stuff, but his press was very definitely evidence-based psychotherapy. And he didn't, and discussing metaphysical or psychospiritual things was not part of his framework or his publishing or his practice. And then when his son was murdered by kids stealing his bicycle, his son was, I think, in his early 20s at the time. And initially the despair was overwhelming and the sense of loss absolute. And I don't exactly, the stories in both books, but he tells it first in Seeking Jordan, that he ended up going to Chicago and studying EMDR with somebody there who had adapted EMDR for contacting the dead.
Yeah,
And
there's Dr. Alan Botkin. Dr. Alan Botkin, yeah.
And in the second book, the one I did with Inner Traditions called The Luminous Landscape of the Afterlife, I tried to get it to be called, Matt had named it Jordan's Book of the Dead, but nobody went for that. I had something else. I'm trying to think of what my idea was. It also was turned down, and they ended up with The Luminous Landscape of the Afterlife, about which I'm kind of neither here nor there. But at the back of the book, he presents a technique that anybody, he says, can use to contact somebody in the afterlife. And although I didn't take on the technique or anything, I did. Well, I have another story that's really kind of neat because it's very present. It made me think that messages are coming all the time, and that I'm not attuned to it, and they could come. I mean, I have a cousin who is a little bit younger than me, and whose dentist husband died very suddenly and unexpectedly, and she's had this bird in the backyard, the same bird, big like crow, continuously come really close to her. And then she traveled and the crow showed up in other countries and she was sure it was the same crow. Well, that doesn't happen. I mean, there was a whole segment on in the Netflix thing about death, life after death, about birds as carriers of spirits. But I also think that the messages are there and we just don't know how to read them, that they're coming all the time. What I was thinking of was in Bar Harbor, I've on and off for years, but I'm doing it now. I run a psychic group. I say run it. I'm not at all that skilled in it, but I convene it and I organize it, and when nothing's happening, I provide exercises. And people come, many of them much more skilled than I am, happy to find a community. And we had, I think the most we had this year was about 10 or 11 people. And at least we had 2 or 3 every time. And 2 sessions ago, a woman emailed me because I was posting it online. I was posting it on a local barter and swap site and yeah, I got stupid jokes every time I posted it. Every time I posted it, people said, well, if it's a psychic group, why do you have to post? And I got tired of that. this woman wrote me. I had no idea who she was, and she showed up, and I'd say she was in her mid-20s with a 4-year-old. And she obviously had tremendous skills, and she read the soul of everyone. And there were 7 people, other people there that night. And she did a soul reading of everyone and said that, and they were spot on. And I think she has a big career in front of her, but she's just beginning. It's still a bit rough. But at the end, I was last. And she said to me, I also have some messages for you, but I'll tell you in private. And so I'm in Portland now. In Portland, Maine. I was going to see her on the way down here, but missed. And so tomorrow on the way back, I'm supposed to stop and hear what the messages are. And I don't know from whom or what form they'll take, but I'm just struck by the fact that I think it's become more, the field has become more open now, and that people are growing up believing that they can do this, and that young people pick it up from the environments, from people around them, and they just do it. And I think most of us have to learn it, certainly of my generation. And well, Mark had a medium for a father, even though you weren't close to him or around him for a lot of your childhood, it was still there. But I think for most of us, we've had to undo a lot of layering and just try and get back to this simple awareness. I asked my oldest psychic friend, Elias Lonsdale, who does wonderful readings. They're spirit readings. They're not mediumship. They're your spirit, he reads. I said, when did you realize you could do it, and how do you do it? And he said he realized it in high school, although it took him a while to cultivate it. And he said, the way you do it is you empty everything else out, and then it comes in.
Stephanie asked, will you please report back to us on those messages? Would love to know.
Okay. Yeah.
So I can definitely relay them later.
Okay. Yeah. I will send Mark. I'll actually cut and paste. I did it in this Bottoming Out the Universe book, but I also wrote a much longer version in the memoir book I call Out of Babylon. And I'll send Mark my report of the channeling I did with Sally Crow, so you can see all the levels of that. I realized, of course, I could just share that directly. And I did a shorter version in this book where I didn't go into all the personal details.
Teresa asked, what kinds of things do they tell you in a soul reading?
They tell you, I mean, they could tell you anything. I got one for our daughter about 2 years ago, and she's like this Hollywood superstar, indie developer, indie movie director, novelist and stuff. And she got told about the missing part of her being that in this incredibly successful career had not been developed, and it moved her to tears. And in Elias's when I was going through a really dark period in 2018, what Elias told me was that, and it turned out to be really true, he said, not all of you incarnated initially. It was too dangerous. And now the rest of you is incarnated, and it's really hard for it to be here because it's like a newborn, and it's suddenly in this body and having to respond to the world as it is. And that turned out to be an incredibly valuable piece of information that I don't know if it's true in a literal sense, but it was really true. I had to age that part of myself incredibly rapidly. It took 850 days, as I think I told Mark. I counted the days till I finally emerged and got out of the dark the depression that was created by the overwhelming sense of loss with that. I'm trying to think of other things that that soul readings tell. Well, I'd have to really break and think about it for a while, but it's things like that that you get from it. If you want, I'll share Elias's phone number. I'll give it to Mark, and he can share it with the group, right?
Sure.
We'll want to do a reading with him. I think we both Mark and I, and Mark's been much more of an explorer in this than I have, but we both look for people who are really good at this. Like I'm really pleased by finding this young ingenue, and I gave her a place, a New Age mall in Hartford, Connecticut, where if she's up for driving down there, she can get paid for sitting there and doing readings during the day. It's in Windsor, Connecticut, and I just love stuff like that. To think that she would grow, and who knows what she'll attain as she develops those capacities.
You don't happen to have that phone number handy to where we could
Sure.
post it right now, do you?
Yep.
Yeah, that would be
Okay.
great. Somebody's asking for it.
Okay. Yeah, he's
It's
like,
ELIAS.
There's a whole session talking about him, but I met him in the 70s when I lived in Vermont. He's presently in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. He's itinerant these days. 808-785-6800. And I'll give you Sally Crow's also while we're at it. Let's see, Sally Crow. Sally Crow, 802-473-2907. And she does do what I would call, it's not a nice word, but I would call it necromancy.
That was 802-473-2907.
I think so. I'm going to have to, 473-2907.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that word has a negative connotation to it. From the
I know
Old Testament.
Sally didn't want me using it in her book, but in a sense, I mean, I guess you don't want to think of it as necrology. You want to think of it as like soul shift, right? You want, or luminous landscape.
Yeah.
Or
we're down to about 1 minute. So if there's any final questions for Richard, pop them in now.
Mhm.
Otherwise, just thank you very much for coming. It's been
thank you.
having the dialogue.
Yeah.
Elizabeth or Irene, do you have anything else? Teresa wants to know if you can come back again. They want your email.
I was trying to figure out how to unmute myself. What we normally do at the end of this is always allow people to be able to unmute themselves and say thank you and goodbye. It looks to me like, Irene, have you done that? Because I'm
Yes.
trying to, okay.
I have also, you can email me at Inner Traditions. I use the second half of my first name, Chard, C-H-A-R-D, at innertraditions.com. You can email me at that email address.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. Everyone's loved the talk, and thank you, Mark, for doing this as well.
Yes, thank you.
You were great. So if everyone would like to go ahead and unmute yourselves and say
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thanks so much.
Richard and
Thank
Mark.
you very much.
Thank you both
Good night.
very much.
This
We'll
was
see you Monday
fabulous.
night.
Thank you.
You have a nice
Thank
evening
you so much.
with Raymond Moody, Dr. Raymond Moody.
Monday night, yes.
Monday. So we look forward to seeing you. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend. Take
Bye,
care.
everybody.
Bye.